The unexpected breakdown late afternoon sun melted into the golden horizon as Sundar Pichai's car gently hummed along a winding countryside road. It was a rare getaway from the boardrooms and high-stakes decisions of Silicon Valley. Sundar wasn't one for flashy appearances or extravagant retreats. This trip was about stillness, solitude, and reconnection with simplicity. A single weekend off-grid, no devices, no meetings, just silence and nature. The rented electric car glided over patches of uneven asphalt as he headed toward a modest, family-run eco lodge in Northern California. A sudden jolt shook the car. The dashboard blinked furiously, red warning lights danced erratically, system malfunction, powertrain failure. He sighed. It had been years since he dealt with a breakdown firsthand. Usually, someone else would be on the phone with a fleet service or support team. But here, in the vast countryside with no signal and miles between towns, he was alone. Pulling off to the shoulder, he stepped out. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and distant wood smoke. Rolling hills blanketed with amber grass stretched into the distance. There was no one in sight, just the wind and the faint rustling of trees. He checked his phone. No service. Sundar took a deep breath, grateful for the unexpected pause. In the stillness, he could feel the universe whisper, not everything can be solved with a signal. A gravel path led from the road down to a small wooden sign that read, Harrison and Son Auto Services. Estate, 1963, with a hand-painted arrow pointing downhill. With no better option, Sundar decided to walk. The hidden garage half a mile later. Sundar reached a clearing nestled between the sloping hills. There, under the shade of an enormous oak tree, stood an old garage. It looked as if time had slowed around it. The faded paint, the hanging license plates from decades past, and a rusting Coca-Cola machine out front spoke of a bygone era. It had warmth, not the corporate, manufactured kind, but a lived-in, real kind. Like the heartbeat of a small town, a bell jingled as Sundar stepped inside. Be with you in a moment. A voice called from under a lifted truck. Emerging from beneath the chassis was a man in his late 70s, wearing a denim shirt smudged with grease and a welcoming smile. His hands were calloused from decades of honest work, his back slightly bent from the weight of time. You got trouble, I reckon, the old man said, wiping his hands. Car or life, Sundar chuckled. Car, but sometimes they feel the same. The man extended his hand. Name's Walter. Been fixing cars longer than most people been alive. Sundar, he replied, shaking his hand. Pleasure. Walter nodded. You ain't from around here, are you? Sundar smiled. Not quite. Just passing through. Walter walked outside with him to inspect the car. After a few moments under the hood and some mechanical murmuring, he looked up. Your electric drive's fried. I don't have the parts, but I can get them. Might take a week. A week? Sundar asked. That's longer than I plan to stay. Walter smiled. Sometimes life plans longer for us. He motioned for Sundar to follow him back to the garage. The garage with a soul inside. The garage was more than a workplace. It was a museum of stories. Photographs lined the walls. Generations of mechanics, customers, and family barbecues. In one picture, a younger Walter stood proudly beside a teenager holding a wrench. Smiling ear to ear. That your son? Sundar asked. Walter's eyes softened. That's Jimmy. Lost him years ago, but he's still around. Every bowl I turn, I hear him laugh. Sundar said nothing, just nodded with quiet respect. He could feel the ache in the air, not bitter, but lovingly mournful. You can leave the car here. I'll start on it tomorrow, Walter offered. Town's just a half-mile east. You'll find a diner, a library, and if you're lucky, some peace. The quiet town that night, Sundar checked into a humble inn run by a retired schoolteacher. The room was small, but clean and cozy, with a window facing the hills. He wandered into the diner, where the waitress brought him pie without asking. New face, she said. We don't get many of those. What brings you? Car trouble. He replied. She nodded as if that explained everything. Sometimes, the best things come wrapped in a flat tire. Over the next few days, Sundar wandered the town, talking to people, sitting by the river, and reading old books at the library. He hadn't felt this grounded in years. Away from the emails, the calendars, the scrutiny, he began to remember who he was before the world knew his name. Fixing more than engines back at the garage, Walter worked quietly but purposefully. Sundar visited him daily, not to check on the car, but to help. They spoke of life, not business, of loss, love, and what mattered beyond success. One day, Sundar asked him, "Why do you still work? You could retire, rest." Walter paused, "Because every car has a story, and every person behind the wheel is someone worth knowing." He handed Sundar a wrench. "Here, help me fix this carburetor." "But I don't know how," Sundar said. Walter winked. "Everyone starts there." Kinu's visit exactly a week later, just as promised, the car was ready. Sundar stood beside it, marveling at the old man's craftsmanship. As he thanked Walter, a motorcycle rumbled into the driveway. A man in black leather and a kind smile stepped off. "Walter," he called. Sundar turned, stunned. It was Keanu Reeves. Walter beamed. "Well, I'll be. Look who the wind blew in." Keanu hugged the old man with genuine warmth. "Had to come see my favorite mechanic." Keanu turned to Sundar, surprised. "Wait, you're Sundar Pichai." Sundar nodded, smiling. "Guilty." Keanu laughed. "What are you doing here?" Sundar looked at Walter. "Car trouble. But I think I was supposed to find this place." Keanu turned serious. "Walter saved me 2 years ago. Broke down on the same road. Spent a week here. Changed me." Walter chuckled. "I don't do miracles. I just fix what's broken." Keanu looked at Sundar, then at the garage. "He doesn't just fix cars. He fixes souls." A promise mattered before Sundar left. He sat with Walter on the porch of the garage. "You ever think about retiring?" Sundar asked again. Walter nodded. "Every morning, but something always shows up. Someone who needs more than just a repair." Sundar looked at the tools, the walls, the photos. "This place matters." Walter nodded again. "Quiet." Sundar said gently, "What if we made sure it always stayed open? A foundation, free repairs for those who can't afford them, stories preserved, a sanctuary for the lost." Walter looked at him, eyes glassy. "You do that?" Sundar smiled. "You already did more for me than you know. Let me help keep it going." And just like that, a handshake sealed it. Two men from different worlds, bound by kindness, memory, and purpose. The blueprint of kindness in the days that followed. Sundar Pichai returned to his world of towering skyscrapers, high-stakes negotiations, and digital empires. But something within him has shifted irrevocably. The endless stream of data and decisions felt distant now, as if he had been living underwater and had finally surfaced for breath. The memory of that quiet garage nestled in the hills, the scent of oil mingled with old pine wood, and Walter's time-worn hands repairing more than just broken engines. It haunted him in the best way possible. Even as he sat in executive boardrooms, fielding questions from analysts and teams, a part of him remained on that porch, listening to the soft hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves over grease-stained photographs. He had made a promise not just to Walter, but to something bigger than either of them. The world was full of people like Walter, humble, skilled, fading into the background of a society that too often glorified what was loud and fast while overlooking the quiet craftsmanship that held it all together. Sundar had returned with more than memories. He carried an idea, fully formed in his heart before it ever took shape on paper. Within 2 weeks, he arranged a discreet team of legal advisors, philanthropic consultants, and brand strategists. But this wasn't a press release kind of project. He didn't want it to be slick or polished. He wanted it to be real. He wanted to protect what made Walter's garage feel sacred. It was about honoring legacy, preserving dignity, and planting the seeds of kindness where the world had forgotten how to look. He reached out to Keanu, who was shooting a film in Vancouver at the time. It took just one call, one conversation. About Walter, about the smell of old oil and the wisdom in his eyes, and Keanu was in, not just as a supporter, but as someone emotionally invested in the mission. They agreed this wouldn't be just a foundation, it would be a movement. Not a glossy charity with celebrity endorsements, but a network of humble, hidden places across the country, places like Walter's where people could find help, healing, and sometimes even themselves. They called it the Promise Network. Each location would start as a Promise garage, based on Walter's blueprint. Skill. Semi-retired mechanics would run the spaces, supported by a fund that provided tools, parts, and living stipends. But the vision was deeper than repairs. It was about storytelling. Every garage would document the lives that passed through photographs, journals, audio interviews. Mechanics would become mentors. Visitors would be invited to sit, stay, talk. A library of lives. built in Greece and compassion back in the hills. Walter remained blissfully unaware of the whirlwind taking shape. He kept fixing cars, one rickety sedan at a time, helping stranded strangers and sipping his morning coffee as if time had paused just for him. He didn't own a smartphone. His only connection to the world was a dusty radio and the conversations he had with people who wandered in with busted exhausts or confused expressions. His smile hadn't changed in decades. It was the kind that didn't come from charm, but from living long enough to understand what mattered. But one morning, as he adjusted the carburetor of a 1997 Buick, a sleek, black Tesla rolled into the dirt driveway, not broken, not smoking, just clean and precise. Out stepped Sundar, dressed not in a suit, but in a simple checkered shirt and jeans. Walter wiped his hands on his apron and grinned, eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," Walter said, walking toward him. Sundar stepped forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "I came to talk about the future." Walter squinted. "Mine or yours?" "Both," Sundar replied, "and maybe a few thousand others." They sat on the porch again, just like that. First afternoon, and this time Sundar brought blueprints not just of buildings, but of ideas. He unrolled them slowly, carefully, explaining how everything would work. Not in a way that overwhelmed, but in a way that invited Walter in. No sudden changes, no business takeovers, just an expansion of what Walter already was, a quiet healer. In a loud world, Walter listened without interrupting, sipping his coffee, nodding slowly. His eyes, though aged, missed nothing. When Sundar finished, there was a long pause. The trees rustled behind them. A bluebird landed on the rusted hood of an old Pontiac. Finally, Walter said, "I've been waiting for something like this. I just didn't know it." Sundar leaned back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So you'll let us start here?" Walter smiled. "We already started the day you walked in broken down." News traveled faster than Sundar expected. Keanu, true to his promise, flew down personally to meet with Walter and filmed a quiet, honest short video describing his experience. It was posted on a barely branded channel, no logos, no corporate polish, just him, sitting beside Walter, telling the story of how a stranger with oil-stained hands taught him something deeper than fame ever could. The video went viral within days, not because of celebrity, but because of sincerity. People weren't just watching, they were remembering a grandparent who fixed their bike, a neighbor who repaired radios for free, a roadside stranger who offered help with no expectation. Donations flooded in, but more importantly, letters began arriving at the garage. Handwritten ones. From teenagers, veterans, single mothers, even prison inmates. Thousands of messages from people who had been touched by kindness in their hardest moments. Some wanted to volunteer, others wanted to offer their own garages, their own skills. The Promise Network had begun. They started with 3 locations. One in Northern California, Walter's original. One in Georgia, run by a retired African-American woman named Miss Lula, who used to teach high school out of shop and had kept her own garage open for neighborhood kids. The third in Michigan, in a former industrial town long forgotten after the factories closed. Each garage was infused with local culture, with mechanics chosen not just for their skills, but for their character. The motto was simple, but powerful. Every customer paid what they could. If they had nothing, they were still welcome, and if they had more, they could donate toward someone else's repair. The walls of each Promise garage were lined with photographs, handwritten notes, and a wooden board titled Kindness Ledger, where each act of generosity was recorded not with names, but with stories. One entry read, "Repaired a single mom's transmission. She brought back cookies and a thank you note." Another said, "Teenager helped repaint the shop after his dad's brakes were fixed for free." Every act echoed outward. Sundar visited each location quietly, without fanfare. He listened more than he spoke, often spending hours in the corner, talking to locals, understanding their needs, their fears, their quiet resilience. He knew then that this was no side project, it was the most meaningful work of his life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Georgia hills, he stood beside Miss Lula outside her garage. She was short, fierce, and kind-eyed, wiping her hands on a cloth as they watched a boy tinker with an old scooter. "You know," she said, "we didn't need another millionaire telling us what to do, but we did need someone to believe we were worth doing it for." Sundar looked at her, humble. "I didn't come to lead, I came to learn." She smiled, and that's why you're leading anyway. Meanwhile, back at Walter's original garage, a new chapter was unfolding. He had begun mentoring a group of local teens boys and girls who used to skip school, who now showed up every afternoon asking to learn how to change oil, how to use a torque wrench, how to rebuild a carburetor from scratch. They weren't just learning about engines. They were learning about discipline, patience, and the quiet pride that comes from building something with your hands. Walter, who once worked alone in silence, now found himself surrounded by laughter, clumsy tool drops, and questions shouted across the shop. He taught them not just how to repair, but how to listen. The car tells you what it needs, he'd say. You just gotta shut up long enough to hear it. One boy, Marcus, had never spoken in class, always labeled as troubled, but at the garage, he became the best welder among them. Another girl, Jasmine, started designing custom paintwork, mixing colors with an artist's eye. Walter watched all this with quiet wonder. His life, which he thought was slowing down, was suddenly full again, and Sundar, he kept coming back, not as a guest, not even as a founder, but as family. He helped fix flats. He learned how to replace brake pads. He sat with the kids and listened to their music, their dreams. Some didn't even know who he was, just that he was Mr. S, who always brought snacks, and asked how their day went. One night, as the stars blinked into the sky and the garage lights buzzed warm overhead, Walter sat beside Sundar again. Much like that first afternoon. "You changed a lot of lives," Walter said. Sundar looked around. The laughter, the sparks from the welding torch, the smell of rubber and motor oil. "No," he said softly, "they changed mine." The ripple that reached the ocean bee the time autumn brushed its golden fingers. Across the countryside, the Promise Network had quietly grown into something larger than anyone had expected. What began as a single act of generosity, a roadside breakdown, a humble mechanic's wisdom, and an honest conversation between two strangers was now a multi-state initiative, quietly revolutionizing the way people viewed service, purpose, and human connection. And yet, even as the mission expanded, Sundar remained grounded in the same values that started it all: humility, community, and trust in the simple act of showing up for one another. What made the movement unique wasn't scale, it was sincerity. Each Promise garage that opened across the country retained the soul of Walter's original shop. No two looked the same. Each was a reflection of its neighborhood. Some were tucked behind train yards in rusted-out buildings with vines creeping up the walls. Others were reimagined barns on the edge of quiet farming towns. But no matter the exterior, the interiors all bore the same elements: a wall of stories, a kindness ledger, and people helping people without judgment or red tape. In New Mexico, a garage run by a retired Navajo engineer and his daughter became a safe space for indigenous teens to learn not just mechanics, but cultural pride and confidence. In the Bronx, a shop co-led by a Puerto Rican former street racer turned mentor helped reduce local juvenile crime by more than 40% in just 6 months. In Oregon, a disabled veteran named Theo transformed his modest repair space into a sanctuary for fellow vets battling PTSD, using the rhythm of repairs to bring calm where words often failed. The true strength of the Promise Network was not in the tools or donations, it was in the stories. And it was Sundar's insistence that every voice, every act of courage and vulnerability be honored, not marketed, not monetized, just preserved. Sundar traveled to each site without cameras, staying in modest inns, wearing the same broken-in sneakers and denim shirt. He helped sand rust-off fenders, poured coffee for volunteers, sat with mothers whose cars were their only means to get to work. With every visit, he asked one question that guided the project's future: what do you need that no one else has ever asked you for? And he listened. But even in this wide arc of growth and compassion, life, true to its nature, still held shadows beneath the light. One afternoon, Sundar received a call that stilled him. Where he stood, Walter had fallen ill. It began with fatigue, then coughing, and finally a visit to the county hospital, where doctors found what everyone fears but few expect: advanced stage pulmonary fibrosis, worsened by years of breathing in fine particles, fumes, and dust from a lifetime beneath hoods and underbelly frames. The illness was aggressive and inoperable. There were treatments to slow it, but no promises. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not Walter. When Sundar arrived at the small hospital nestled in the hills near the original garage, Walter was propped up in bed, breathing through a tube with difficulty, but his eyes were still. bright, still sharp. He smiled as Sundar walked in, a small oxygen monitor blinking beside him. A faded photograph of his son Jimmy was taped to the wall, just above a picture of the promised garage filled with the young students he had mentored. Guess even machines wear out, Walter rasped, his voice dry but amused. Sundar pulled a chair beside him, his hands quietly clasped together, trying to form words that didn't feel like goodbye. "You're not a machine," Sundar said. "You're the engine." Walter gave a gentle chuckle, wincing a little from the pain. "Well, even engines need rest." There was a long pause. Outside the window, the trees swayed as if bowing their heads. Sundar finally said, "We've opened 14 new garages, and there are 20 more in planning. People are applying from places I've never even heard of. They're saying this. Work is changing their communities, their families, their lives." Walter looked at him, his breath shallow. "Good. But tell me something, Sundar, are you changing too?" It was a simple question, but it hit deeper than any report or achievement ever could. Sundar thought of the nights he'd spent in those garages, talking with strangers, hearing stories of love, loss, and dreams still trying to bloom. He thought of Marcus, the quiet welder, of Jasmine with her paints, of Miss Lula teaching respect alongside repairs. He remembered how he used to think of success as numbers and growth charts. But now, he counted it in hugs, handshakes, and handwritten letters. "Yes," he said, voice steady, "in ways I can't explain." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, nodding. Then it was all worth it. Word of Walter's condition spread quietly, but quickly through the network. The community responded the only way it knew how, through action, not noise. Each Promise garage began dedicating one wall to a Walter board. On it, people left messages for the man who had unknowingly started it all. Mechanics wrote notes about their first repairs. Children drew pictures of Walter as a superhero. Elderly women who had received free oil changes sent poems and pressed flowers. A Promise garage in Italy, which had just joined the network thanks to a retired Formula One technician, created a mural of Walter surrounded by olive trees and open tools. Keanu, now deeply invested in the movement, visited the hospital one evening. With no entourage, no press, he brought a single guitar and sat beside Walter, strumming softly as the old mechanic smiled weakly, tapping his fingers to the beat. They didn't need words. They shared something older than speech, the unspoken bond of gratitude. In one moment of rare stillness, Walter said to both of them, "Don't let this become an empire. Let it stay a family. Promise me." And they did. As Walter's condition worsened, Sundar made a decision that surprised his board, his team, and even his own family. He announced that he would be stepping away temporarily from most of his corporate responsibilities. No grand announcement, no drama, just a quiet message. Sometimes leadership means knowing when to serve elsewhere. His next few months were spent organizing something very specific, a final tribute, not a funeral, not a ceremony, but a drive. They call it the Final Repair Run, a national road trip, visiting each Promise garage, one by one, carrying a part of Walter's legacy across the country. Each stop would include a free service day, storytelling circles, and mentorship workshops. And in every town, they would install a small handcrafted plaque, reading, "Inspired by Walter Harrison, because kindness is the only engine that never fails." Walter passed away quietly in his sleep just 2 days before the first stop of the tour. He had seen the route. He had heard the stories, and he knew, in that secret, quiet place we all hold inside, that his life had not only mattered but had become a light for thousands. The first stop of the Final Repair Run took place back in his hometown. Hundreds of people gathered at the original garage, including every young person he had mentored. Now wearing matching blue overalls embroidered with the word Walter's Crew, Keanu spoke, not from a stage, but from a folding chair, sharing how this quiet man had saved his soul during a time of burnout and loneliness. Sundar spoke next, but not as a CEO, just as a man who had once been stranded and found something far more valuable than a working car. The final speaker was Marcus, now 17, who had just received a full scholarship in mechanical engineering, thanks to his work at the garage. His voice trembled as he read from a letter he had written to Walter weeks before his passing. "You told me I was worth fixing, and because you believed it, I started to believe it, too." As the sun set behind the hills, everyone in the crowd lit a small lantern. One by one, they released them into the sky, Hundreds of glowing lights rose above the town, like souls made visible, drifting upward, and somewhere beyond the clouds. Beyond the sky there was a whisper of a chuckle, the soft creak of a garage door, and an old man smiling, his hands forever stained with the beauty of honest work. The girl, who knew the wind's final repair run continued for weeks after Walter's passing, rolling slowly across state lines and into towns and cities of every shape and soul. It was not a tour in the traditional sense. There were no banners, no fanfare, no polished speeches or concerted press releases. Instead, it was something softer, something slower, something more lasting. In each town, word simply spread, from barber shops to grocery stores, from school bulletin boards to the back seats of taxis, that the promised network was coming, and that for one day, everyone was welcome, no questions asked, to have their car repaired, their story heard, and their dignity honored. Sundar traveled with the team through each stop, wearing the same navy work shirt bearing the promised patch, his sleeves rolled up and palms sometimes blackened with grease by midday. There was something grounding about it, more honest than any quarterly review or strategy session. The work was direct, real, and for a man whose world was often digital, intangible, fast-moving, it became a ritual of rehumanization. Each socket wrench turn felt like a conversation with the world, an unspoken answer to the silent questions we all carry. Do I matter? Will someone show up when I'm broken? But it was in a small coastal town in Oregon that the journey, once again, took a turn Sundar did not expect. The kind of turn that, like the ocean tide, does not announce itself with lightning, but with a slow shifting of the wind, subtle, yet unstoppable. The town of Sageport sat curled along a rocky inlet, known more for its fishing docks and salt-sprayed cliffs than any tourist appeal. There was no welcome sign with flashing lights, no downtown promenade, just a scattering of cottages, a lighthouse that still functioned with storms pressed in from the Pacific, and a small garage with a faded sign that read, Bay and Daughters Repairs. Though everyone in town simply called it Bay's, it had been recommended to the Promise team by word of mouth. A volunteer mechanic in Seattle had once worked there during his teenage years and had never forgotten it. There's a girl there, he said, young, maybe 25, maybe younger, fixes everything like she was born with a wrench in her hand. But more than that, she listens. Curious and guided by instinct, Sundar added Sageport to the itinerary when they arrived. The morning fog had just begun to lift off the docks, leaving everything glistening and quiet. The town stirred slowly, a fisherman's rhythm, not out of laziness, but out of understanding that haste rarely solved what patience could. The garage stood near the edge of the wharf, not large but strong-looking, with cedar planks weathered by salt and time. Outside, a rusted 1970 Ford pickup waited with its hood up like a yawning mouth. Inside, the sound of a ratchet echoed, rhythmic, precise, purposeful. That was the first time Sundar saw Lena Bay. She wasn't what most expected of a mechanic, barely in her 20s, with dark, windswept curls tied back in a bandana, hands stained from elbow to fingertip with oil and grit. She moved like someone who had found their purpose and refused to be distracted from it. Her eyes, pale green like storm-lit ocean water, flicked up briefly when the team entered, a single glance, sharp and assessing, and then returned to the carburetor she was rebuilding. Back doors open. If you're here for help, wait till I finish this carb, she said without looking. Keanu Reeves, who had joined this leg of the journey, raised his eyebrows in amusement. I like her already, he whispered. Sundar stepped forward. We're from the Promise Network, he said calmly. We heard about your work. We wanted to invite you to be part of something we're building. She didn't flinch or freeze. She just kept working. I know who you are, she said, voice even. I saw the video about Walter. I don't do interviews, and I don't want cameras in here. Sundar nodded. We didn't bring any. We just came to learn. This time, she looked up fully, her eyes locking onto his in a way that felt almost too honest. Then grab a wrench, she said. You can learn while we work over the next few hours. Sundar and the team became students in her classroom of steel, rust, and resolve. Lena taught with precision, explaining systems as she fixed them, not with condescension, but with clarity. She had a gift, not just for repairs, but for understanding things on a mechanical and emotional level. She could hear what others missed, in engines, in people, in the space between words. It wasn't long before the townsfolk began arriving. a retired dockhand whose brakes squeaked like gulls, a single mother with a Corolla that stalled in the rain, a young fisherman who didn't speak much but trusted Lena enough to hand over the only thing he owned, his old, sea-salted pickup. Each person came not just for repairs, but for her presence between tasks. Sundar watched her closely. There was something in Lena he couldn't quite define, a silence that wasn't emptiness, but rather a deep reservoir of experience. She didn't talk about herself. She didn't ask about Sundar's position or past. She seemed almost untouched by reputation, which intrigued him. Most people he met wanted something Lena didn't want. She offered later that evening, as the garage lights dimmed and the ocean wind picked up. They sat outside on a crate in an upturned bucket, sipping tea from chipped mugs. Lena finally broke the quiet. "My father died fixing a rig on Highway 101, she said simply. Didn't have to be there, but he went because someone called, panicking. He was like that. Never turned away anyone who needed help." Sundar nodded, not interrupting. "After he passed, I kept the garage open. Everyone thought I'd sell it. I didn't. I couldn't. I don't have his strength, but I have his ears. I hear things people don't say. That's what I fix, not just engines, but the silences." Sundar felt something shift in his chest, the same sensation he'd had sitting beside Walter, a rare kind of stillness that came not from absence, but from alignment, from recognizing a soul with the same frequency. "You're already one of us," he said quietly. She smiled, a soft, tired smile, and looked out toward the water. "I didn't need an invitation," she said. "I just needed you to show up." The next morning, Lena agreed to join the Promise Network under one condition: no branding, no headlines, just her garage with a small plaque hidden in the corner, reading, "A promise kept." She didn't want glory. She wanted consistency. And truthfully, so did Sundar. They left Sageport 2 days later, changed once again, not by big revelations, but by Lena's calm insistence on quiet purpose, on doing the work, even when no one is watching. As the final repair run continued through the rest of the country, Sundar began receiving handwritten letters addressed not just to him, but to Mr. S. Many came from kids in towns they hadn't even visited yet. Some wrote about wanting to become mechanics. Others just wanted to say thank you. One envelope stood out. Inside was a simple drawing, a garage under a tree with stick figures holding wrenches, surrounded by hearts. At the bottom, it said, "Thank you for making places where we can feel safe." Sundar sat for a long time after reading it, longer than usual, because what began as a roadside mishap had become a movement, not of wealth or success or charity, but of shared humanity. And in a world often overwhelmed by noise, the Promise Network had become a whisper strong enough to be heard everywhere. The pressure to package a Salby the time the final repair run came to its last few stops. The Promise Network had become something much bigger than any one garage, one town, or even one continent. From the quiet streets of Sageport to bustling neighborhoods in Chicago, from converted garages in Germany to desert outposts in Rajasthan, where mechanics worked beneath solar-powered sheds. The idea had taken root in different soils and sprouted in different forms, but the essence had remained intact, or so it seemed. Sundar Pichai, once merely the spark that reignited an old man's quiet way of life, now stood as the reluctant torchbearer of a growing flame. People began referring to the Promise Network as a new kind of movement, praising it in think pieces, policy forums, and university case studies. Documentaries were being pitched. A major streaming service even requested the rights to produce a serialized drama based on the project, though Sundar declined without hesitation. The reason was simple: you cannot dramatize sincerity without destroying it. But with attention came pressure, and with pressure came the slow, subtle erosion of quiet truths. The first signs arrived not with confrontation, but with compliments. Executives from well-known automotive brands began reaching out with partnership offers disguised as philanthropic alignment. They spoke the language of opportunity. Imagine the impact of promise. Garages were co-branded with our innovation labs. Some proposed modernizing the garages with AI repair diagnostics, offering to install glossy tech panels and robotic lifts to optimize labor and efficiency. To someone unfamiliar with the network's soul, these suggestions seemed generous, even visionary. But to those who had stood beneath the cracked ceilings of those garages, who had shared coffee beside chipped mugs and written on kindness boards with trembling hands, It felt like someone offering to repaint a church in neon lights. Sundar, having once lived and breathed the fast-paced, hyper-optimized world of digital innovation, now found himself feeling more protective than ever. Not of the garages as buildings, but of the space they created, spaces where imperfection was welcome, where slow conversations carried more power than any algorithm. He knew what these partnerships would mean: glossy brochures, quarterly deliverables, and eventually the quiet silencing of the human stories in favor of impact metrics. He brought these concerns to his advisory group, a small, hand-picked team of educators, mechanics, community leaders, and storytellers who helped shape the network's heartbeat. They met in person for the first time at the original Promise garage, now lovingly restored, but still bearing Walter's fingerprints. As the autumn wind rustled through the trees, they gathered around a worn table under the old oak tree. Keanu Reeves, now deeply integrated into the advisory group not just as a voice, but as a steadfast guardian of the movement's integrity, was the first to speak. The moment we let them turn this into a brand, he said quietly, we lose Walter. We lose Lena. We lose the kid who wrote that letter about feeling safe. Miss Lula nodded, placing her glasses on the table beside her notes. It's not about refusing help. It's about refusing to be redefined. There was consensus, but there was also realism. The network had grown to a scale that required infrastructure, support, and funding. Donations helped, but they came in waves. Demand was growing exponentially. Thousands of people were applying to start new garages. There were veteran mechanics volunteering their time, but tools, permits, and parts were expensive. Something had to give. That's when a quieter voice spoke. One of the youngest in the room, Lena Bay, flown in from Sageport at Sundar's request, stood near the back, hands shoved in her overall pockets. You don't need their money, she said, calm and direct. You need your own version of scale. Forget networks and branding. Focus on replication. Teach the values, not the model. Sundar looked at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Lena pulled out a folded sheet from her back pocket. It was hand-drawn, a schematic of how she taught mechanical basics to local teens, with notes in the margins not about torque or pressure, but about listening, mentorship, presence. Codify this, she said, tabbing the notes. Build a living document, not a rule book, a rhythm. Share it openly. Let people adopt the values, not the name. The room went quiet for a long time. Sundar stared at the paper. Something in its simplicity unlocked what he had been struggling to articulate for weeks. The answer had been there all along. Legacy isn't protected by fences. It's preserved by imitation. That night, back in his small room above the garage, Sundar began writing what would become known across the Promise network as the Manual of Spirit. It wasn't a guide to fixing engines. It was a guide to fixing trust. It opened with Walter's story, included Lena's teaching methods, testimonials from teens like Marcus and Jasmine, and letters from strangers who had found help in the most unexpected moments. The final chapter was left blank, with a single line at the top, write your own. It was distributed not as a requirement, but as an offering. Anyone could download it, anyone could print it, and anyone could build from it, with or without the Promise name. The corporate pressure, though not fully gone, lost its edge. You couldn't sell something that had no product, no franchise, no pitch. It was just a growing collection of souls choosing kindness in the shape of steel and stories. But even as the storm of attention passed, Sundar found himself standing at a personal crossroads. He had spent so long walking toward something, repairing, mentoring, building, that he hadn't stopped to consider what it meant to rest, not from fatigue, but from internal weight. The truth was, he hadn't really grieved Walter. He hadn't fully let go of the moment that started it all. That day on the side of the road, the red warning lights, the soft creak of a garage door opening, and the voice of an old man saying, car or life. So one morning, long after the public focus had shifted and the network stabilized into something self-sustaining, Sundar drove back to where it had all begun. He didn't tell the team. He didn't bring cameras, just a single backpack, a journal, and the same electric car, now fully repaired, that had first broken down on that remote road. He found the same gravel path. The sign was gone, but the way was still there. The trees had grown, the wind still whispered, and at the bottom of the hill, though the garage had now become a heritage site quietly maintained by local volunteers, Sundar stepped inside and was hit with the same scent, oil, dust, pine, and something unnameable but unforgettable. He sat on the porch, the same porch where he and Walter had talked about legacy, about promises, about why some engines run longer than others. And for the first time in years, Sundar cried, not out of sorrow, but from the profound weight of gratitude. Gratitude for a stranger who had once asked the right question. Gratitude for the lives changed. Gratitude for a world that still had people like Walter, Lena, Miss Lula, and every quiet soul who turned wrenches not for recognition, but because they could, and because someone had to die as the sun sank behind the hills, casting gold across the gravel. Sundar opened his journal and wrote a single line. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what keeps showing up long after you've gone. When the engine knows it's time, there comes a time in every journey, whether of machinery or the human spirit, when something inside begins to whisper not with urgency, but with clarity. It is the quiet knowledge that the road ahead is no longer yours to pave. Sundar Pichai felt that whisper settle within him, not during a grand event, not on stage or in the middle of some high-stakes meeting, but in the stillness of a cool spring morning, seated under a canopy of wisteria vines, outside a promised garage in Vermont. The air was crisp, the sky quiet, and inside, a group of high school students were learning to change brake pads from a young woman who had once been a customer of the very garage they now trained in. The wheel had turned. The legacy was growing not because Sundar held it, but because he had finally let it breathe. He sipped his coffee, watching them from a distance, and he knew in a way he could no longer deny. It was time to step back. He had lived every chapter of the Promise Network's story, from the quiet roadside breakdown that began it all, to the long nights drafting the manual of spirit, to the boardroom conversations he once feared might corrupt the movement, to the mural of Walter now painted on 100 walls around the world. He had seen Lena build her own branch of the model without ever needing approval. He had watched Marcus, the once silent boy with welding scars on his knuckles, graduate college and return to teach at the very garage that had once saved him. He had stood in front of broken engines, lost teens, weeping elders, and humbled billionaires, and in every one of them, he saw Walter. But now he saw something else too. He saw a future that no longer needed his name to flourish. The conversation about transition began not with strategy, but with a question. Sundar gathered the original advisory circle, Keanu Reeves, Miss Lula, Lena Bay, and 3 others from different continents who had grown into leadership quietly, without expectation. They met not in a formal setting, but in a converted barn outside Colorado Springs that doubled as both a community hall and a functioning garage. The air smelled of sawdust and coffee outside. The last patches of snow were melting inside. They sat in a circle, each with hands calloused by something real. Sundar began slowly, not with an announcement, but with honesty. I've been holding this close because it mattered. He said, eyes steady, voice even, but now I think it's time to let go, not in absence, but in trust. There was no protest, no panic, only a soft, collective pause. Keanu nodded with the kind of gravity that came from years of silence, loss, and rebuilding. Miss Lula gave a gentle, approving smile. Lena stood up, walked to the table, and placed down a piece of paper she brought with her, a framework, drafted by young volunteers, proposing a decentralized model of leadership. We've been thinking the same thing, she said simply. It's bigger than any one voice now, and that's how it's supposed to be. It was one of those rare moments when the handoff wasn't painful, because no one was being pushed out. Sundar wasn't retiring from meaning. He was evolving into witness, a different kind of leadership, one that taught by example, and eventually, by absence. Within weeks, the shift began. A rotating leadership council was established, composed of active contributors from every region where a Promise Garage operated. They weren't elected by campaign, but nominated by those they served. There were no titles, just roles. No hierarchy, just rhythm. People who knew how to listen became mentors. People who understood fundraising offered guidance without financial control. And people who had once arrived broken and found healing now helped others walk the same path. Each Promise Garage would remain independent, but spiritually connected. They shared stories, methods, and support systems through a digital hub simply called The Lift. No passwords, no fees, just an open-source archive of humanity's best mechanics. Not only of machines, but of lives. Meanwhile, Sundar began a quieter chapter. He didn't disappear, nor did he seek to be remembered. Instead, he moved into what he called field reflection. He visited garages not as a founder or guest of honor, but as a helper. Sometimes he swept floors, other times he sat with a grieving mother whose son had found solace in the garage just weeks before his passing. In Montana, he spent a week helping a young team build a garage from the ground up. Sleeping in a trailer out back, in Morocco, he observed how one mechanic used poetry to teach apprentices discipline. He took notes, not for books, not for speeches, but for himself, and everywhere he went, he found the same truth repeated over and over. This thing now lived in the bones of people who had never met Walter, never read the first manual, never even heard Sundar's name, and still they believed in it. Still, they carried it forward. But one moment, in particular, marked the closing of his chapter more clearly than any structure or vote. It happened at the original Promise Garage, Walter's garage, now maintained not as a museum, but as an active site of service and memory. It was the 10th anniversary of the very day Sundar's car had broken down. Though no ceremony had been planned, the team had chosen to let it pass quietly, honoring the spirit of the work rather than the date. But that morning, when Sundar arrived unannounced, he found the gravel path already crowded with people, not for celebration, but for service. Cars lined the road, neighbors brought food, children were running with hand-drawn signs saying Walter's work lives on. A group of local high schoolers had organized a free service day in his honor, having learned from an apprentice who had learned from another, who had once been taught by Walter himself. At the center of it all stood Marcus, now 26, holding a torque wrench like a baton of memory passed through time. When he saw Sundar, he walked over, smiling with that same crooked grin he'd had as a teenager. He said nothing, just handed him a pair of gloves and nodded toward a stalled minivan at Bay 3. "You've still got a few good turns in you," Marcus said. And so Sundar joined him, side by side, wrenching, laughing, listening, and when the job was done, they both signed the kindness board with the same words, still showing up. That evening, as the sky darkened and lanterns flickered the life around the gravel lot, Sundar sat alone on the porch once more. The same porch, the same view, only now it was filled with 1,000 echoes of lives changed, rebuilt, and reimagined. He opened his journal, now nearly full, and on the last page, he wrote, "I was never meant to lead this forever. I was meant to protect it until others were ready. They are ready." He placed the journal on the old shelf above the workbench, the one where Walter used to keep coffee cans full of screws, and he walked away, not out of the story, but into the background. Where legacy truly lives. The girl in the valley, who heard the echo of the world, never announces. When it decides to change someone's life, it doesn't send warnings or signs, not the way stories would have us believe. Instead, it arrives in quiet moments, the ones that slip through the cracks of routine. For 14-year-old Nadia Barlas, it came on an ordinary afternoon in the Kullu Valley of northern India, while she waited for her father outside a dimly lit motor garage nestled at the base of a forested hill. The town was known for little more than its winding roads and seasonal apple trade, with snow-capped peaks watching like silent sentries. It had no mall, no cinema, and certainly no Promise Garage. But tucked between a temple bell tower and a crumbling brick wall was Singh Auto Repairs, run by a weathered mechanic named Tapan Singh, who had been fixing things since before color televisions had reached the village. He wasn't famous. He didn't know a thing about Sundar Pichai. But in the back of his garage, there hung a dog-eared printout, faded, wrinkled, and pinned to a corkboard with a rusted nail. It was a single page from a document called the Manual of Spirit. No title, no logos, just a hand-scrawled heading. "Don't fix the car, fix the trust." Nadia read that line while waiting for her father's scooter to be repaired. She didn't know who wrote it, or why, but the words sat with her like sunlight through fog. She was a child of few resources, a relentless curiosity. Her world was narrow, mountains, family, and the internet cafe with dial-up speeds. But her hunger for meaning ran deeper than any valley. Tapan had printed that sheet from a Facebook post, shared by his cousin in Jaipur. He couldn't explain where it came from, only that he liked it. It reminded him of his grandfather, who used to tell customers, if you can't give them perfection, give them honesty. He offered Nadia the page with a smile. "Take it. I have it in my head." Now, she folded it gently, slid it into her worn backpack, and carried it home like a relic. That night, in her small room overlooking apricot trees and terrace fields, Nadia copied the line into her diary, but she didn't stop there. She began to imagine the person who wrote it. She wondered who they were, why they believed in fixing trust more than broken machines, and how many people they had helped. She wrote letters addressed only to whoever wrote this. Dozens of them, not asking for help, but sharing thoughts, fears, and stories about how she fixed her friend's broken science project, about how she hated how her uncle yelled at the mechanic who fixed their car for free, about how she wanted to study robotics, but the school barely had enough working tools to teach basic electronics. What Nadia didn't know, couldn't possibly have known, was that her small, unknown valley was about to receive an unexpected visitor. It began with a single story. Lena Bay, now overseeing global mentorship for the Promise Network, was reading through the digital submissions to the Lift, the open archive where stories, messages, and questions poured in from around the world. Most were upgrades, requests, or gratitude notes, but one message stood out. It was from a school teacher in Kalu who explained, in humble English, that a young student had been drawing schematics of hybrid engines based on something she called the mechanic's philosophy, and that she often spoke of a quote, "Don't fix the car, fix the trust." The teacher had found the message while searching online for its origin, and the trail, inevitably, led back to the Promise Network. Lena forwarded it immediately to Sundar. He read it twice, then 3 times, then leaned back in his chair with a strange stillness. He hadn't seen those words in print since writing them late one night in Walter's garage, not as doctrine, but as a reminder, a compass for why they'd begun. And now, halfway around the world, a child who'd never heard his name had absorbed its meaning more truthfully than some adults, who quoted it at conferences. He booked a flight that same week. When Sundar arrived in Kalu, there was no fanfare, no network logo, just him, a satchel, and a long-sleeved shirt rolled up at the cuffs. He met with the teacher who had written the letter, and then, without announcement, visited Singh Auto Repairs. He was struck by how familiar it felt, the way the sunlight angled into the workbench, the distant hum of schoolchildren playing, the scent of motor oil mingled with cedar smoke. Tapan. The mechanic looked up from under a dusty Maruti Suzuki and nodded politely, not recognizing him. "You here to get something fixed?" he asked. Sundar smiled. "No, I'm here to say thank you." When Tapan heard the name and understood who stood before him, he said nothing at first, just offered a stool and poured him chai from a dented kettle. "Funny thing," Tapan said slowly, "that line of yours, it fixed a few things in me too." They spoke for hours, about nothing and everything, about the simplicity of work that matters, about fathers who love to quietly, about how trust once lost is harder to repair than an engine thrown off a cliff. Later that day, Sundar asked quietly, "Do you think I could meet her?" Tapan's eyes twinkled. "The girl who reads your thoughts like scripture?" "Yes. Come tomorrow." When Sundar met Nadia, it wasn't the exchange of mentor and pupil. It wasn't the drama of celebrity and admirer. It was quieter, something older than both those dynamics. It was recognition. She didn't scream or ask for a photo. She only said, "I hope someone like you existed." They spoke on a bench behind her school. He asked about her drawings. She showed him her notebook, filled not only with machines, but with ideas. How to build mobile repair carts for Himalayan roads. How to teach engine repair using Lego kits. How to include storytelling as part of every technical lesson. She hadn't been trained by anyone. She had only read a quote and listened to her instincts. But her instincts had aligned perfectly with everything the Promise Network had come to believe. Sundar asked, "If you had the chance, would you start a garage?" She blinked. "I already have. I just don't have the tools yet." He smiled. "We can help with that. But not by building it for you. You'll design it, lead it, name it." She tilted her head. "Can I name it after someone I've never met?" "Of course," he said. "Names are not ownership. They're remembrance." That evening, she gave him a slip of paper. It had just 3 words, Walter's Echo Bay. 6 months later, the first Promise-affiliated garage in the Himalayan region quietly opened in a stone and wood structure, hand-built by volunteers. No flashy ribbon cuttings, just a chalkboard outside that said, "Open to all, payment optional." Kindness required. Nadia, now 15, was not only its founder, but its first instructor. She led a team of 5 girls and 3 boys, training them with borrowed tools and printed schematics she had pieced together from online PDFs. WhatsApp conversations, and her own dreaming. She kept the original printed quote from Tapin's garage laminated on her desk. As she began writing her own manual, filled not with instructions, but with stories, and Sundar, he watched from afar now, not as a leader, not even as a guide, just as someone who once broke down on a road and met a man with oil on his hands and light in his eyes. A man who asked him not to build an empire, but to protect a promise. The promise had traveled farther than either of them could have imagined. It had reached mountain peaks. It had reached children born long after Walter had passed. It had become something not even time could erode dot, because some engines never stop running, some sparks never die, some words echo forever, the mechanic's promise, the legacy lives.